as Amy said, my name is Kara Crotty. I'm a partner with Constangy Brooks Smith and Proffitt's Columbia, South Carolina office. And I do a lot of work advising federal contractors on affirmative action, compliance issues, and that often involves DEI topics. There's certainly different concepts and different issues involved with affirmative action and DEI, but there's definitely a lot of areas of overlap. So I do spend a lot of my practice advising clients on DEI issues as well. And I did see a question at the beginning about the presentation. Amy can tell you whether or not, I think you'll get a link to the recording, but I know she's got a copy of the slides that she will send out as well. So you'll definitely have access to that information if for some reason you can't attend the whole session. But we're going to be talking today about conducting a DEI audit, why you might want to do that, and things to think about why you are or while you are conducting your DEI audit. So the first question is, why should employers consider doing a diversity, equity, and inclusion audit? We've seen a pretty rapidly changing environment when it comes to DEI issues the past few years. So I think it's helpful to examine why a DEI audit might be good for any employer, any organization that is considering it. So one of the first things is that, when it comes to DEI, the issue really is no longer should we focus on it, but now I think it's, are we doing enough? And one of the things that we have seen is a pretty dramatic increase in the voluntary data disclosures that employers are making. For example, here's some information that shows the difference in a 1-year time period from 2019 and 2020 of the S&P 100 companies and those that disclosed their EEO-1 reports in 2019 versus those that disclosed in 2020. And you can see it's a pretty dramatic increase, a 20% increase of those companies decided to disclose their EEO-1 report information. Now, we know that the EEO-1 data is pretty broad and pretty vague, so it doesn't necessarily give a huge insight into any given organization's demographics or information, but it's definitely a starting point. So I think disclosing EEO-1 data is kind of considered a first step in the ability for their constituents, whether it's employees or shareholders or investors, to hold them accountable to commitments that they might make regarding advancing racial and social justice and equity. However, conversely, I think another interesting statistics that I saw was that smaller companies are still less likely to disclose their EEO-1 report information. So looking at the Russell 1000 market index, which obviously covers a broader scope and swath of companies, the vast majority of those companies included in that market did not disclose their EEO-1 reports. So we're seeing this trend starting to happen with more disclosing them, but it's definitely the larger companies that are choosing to voluntarily disclose this type of information outside the company. And I say voluntary, I should kind of say that in quotation marks, because as you'll see over the next couple of slides, a lot of the decisions to disclose that information is based or prompted by pressure from shareholders. I read this article, it was about a year ago almost, in the Wall Street Journal, talking about the pressure that shareholders were asserting on their companies or the companies that they were invested in, to start releasing that information. And there was a vote at Union Pacific where 86% of the shareholders supported the company's release of their EEO-1 reports. And similarly at DuPont, 84% of shareholders there supported that. So we've seen a lot discussed lately when it comes to ESG and investing, environmental, social, and governance. And I think if I had asked you 2 or 3 years ago, how many of you had heard of the term ESG? Most of us would have been clueless, but certainly in the past few years, this has become a very prominent discussion at most companies. And it's the company's environmental, social, and governance factors that are considered by investors or potential investors. And this is growing in popularity. It's really hard to read any kind of financial report or article that doesn't include some discussion on ESG. And especially since the pandemic, more employers and more investors seem to be focusing on that S, the social aspect of this. So we think that this will certainly equate to companies prioritizing diversity in response to that type of interest and pressure from their shareholders. So we're seeing more investor proposals, not just like on the prior slide where they're requesting release of EEO1 data and information, but we're also seeing proposals that are demanding DEI audits to be done by organizations, or even worse, they're reports of shareholders that have been suing companies where they've argued that their investments have been threatened by a bad work culture. For example, Tesla was in the news about it just a month ago, where there was a shareholder lawsuit alleging a toxic workplace culture within the company has threatened their investment. There was also, this was a few years ago now, but Fox was sued after the Bill O'Reilly brouhaha and that mess, and ended by their shareholders, and that resulted in a $90 million settlement. And I also read about a settlement that Google made for, again, related to these same types of issues for over $300 million, and that included additional DEI initiatives within the organization. We're also seeing the SEC consider updating the reporting requirements for public companies on DEI and these ESG issues. And even voluntarily, we're seeing more companies that are beginning to divulge and share additional DEI information in their SEC reports. So this is certainly something that we expect to continue to grow and expand. Also on the kind of investment side here, you may have heard about the New York City's comptroller's letter to S&P 100 companies publicly or pressuring them to publicly disclose their EEO1 report information and also compensation data. And this goes back to a very large investor here wanting to pressure companies to divulge more information. So one, they can decide whether or not they want to continue the investment, or maybe potentially submit shareholder proposals to require or to support the release of the information, or potentially even nominating board members to those companies that will further those types of initiatives. So this is one example, pretty public and powerful example of that type of progress. Another new initiative is the increasing focus on pay disclosures. Those of you with employees in California are probably very familiar with the California Pay Data Report that's now required on an annual basis. Those with employees in Illinois are probably becoming familiar, if you are not already, with their requirements that you provide race and gender demographics on your workforce, as well as detailed information on employee compensation. And according to the guidelines for those requirements, the Secretary of State in Illinois is actually going to be publishing information on companies' employee demographics, race, gender, and ethnicity. I don't know exactly what format that will take. I'm assuming it will be fairly aggregate information, but that's something that will be forthcoming. And then we are also expecting EEO1 component 2 to return very soon. You'll probably remember the pain point that caused a couple of years ago when companies were required to submit very detailed compensation information or put employees in the different pay bands and include their hours worked. It was very difficult and time-consuming process for most employers. The Trump administration rescinded that rule, but based on the current or soon to be current makeup of the EEOC, they'll soon have a Democratic majority again. That combined with a recent release of the National Academy of Sciences report that provides some guidelines and recommendations on future pay reporting to the EEOC. I think with that combination, we're likely to see component 2 come back in some form or another. I doubt, based on NAS's recommendations, that it's going to be exactly like it was before. But certainly we should expect the EEOC to require some level of pay reporting in the future. We also are seeing a greater importance placed on diversity by employees. So this was a survey done, actually 2 surveys done over a significant period of time. And you can see back in 2008, when employees were surveyed on the importance of their employer having a diverse workforce, diversity ranked very low as a number of options of where they ranked, in order of importance. And you can compare that to 2020, where the importance of diversity increased pretty significantly to employees when it comes to evaluating and selecting potential employers. There was also a pretty interesting survey from Glassdoor just a couple of years ago. And as a result of this survey, the Glassdoor found that 76% of employees and job seekers said that a diverse workforce was important for evaluating job offers. So that goes back to this slide. You can see that's pretty consistent with what this survey found. And then almost half of Black and Hispanic employees and job seekers said that they quit a job after witnessing or experiencing discrimination at work. And then 37% of employees and job seekers said that they would not apply to a company that had negative satisfaction ratings among people of color. So we're definitely seeing that employees are going to sites like Glassdoor, and they're also looking at sites like Dipper. So this was something I found a few, I guess, months ago now, or a year ago, when I was researching on this topic. And I found this site that is kind of like a Glassdoor, but it's for, or LinkedIn type of situation for professionals of color, where they can share their workplace experiences. So employers should certainly be mindful that there are these communities out there where people are sharing information about the work environment and the culture of the places where they work. Another significant metric is this disparities in advancement. A study showed that while people of color are certainly increasing representation at entry-level positions in organizations, there's still a glass ceiling effect that's happening. when you compare entry-level representation to representation of people of color at executive level positions, it's dropping off significantly. I mean, there's certainly a lot of things that could explain that, but the fact that it's happening and continues to occur is certainly something that we should be mindful of, and that companies that are focusing on their DEI efforts, want to explore whether or not that's happening at their organization, and trying to determine if there's a cause and something that can be resolved and corrected. So also something to be aware of or to consider when you are delving into your DEI practices is this, I call it the pendulum effect, or overcorrecting. But we always have to remember that employers are prohibited from discriminating against individuals on the basis of race or gender. So even though we have great and robust DEI policies and practices, we still can't use race or gender when making employment decisions. And I read an article about it, and it was basically just describing employees and from a certain company and their perspective on that organization's DEI policies. And this is a huge caveat. This was just interviews with, I think, a small handful of employees, but they expressed concern that the company's environment was unwelcoming to individuals that were not African American, and they felt that there was such a focus within the companies on DEI and DEI training, and that their perception, right or wrong, their perception was that the company would only hire and promote African Americans. So they reported that some of their colleagues that were not in that demographic felt small, they felt overlooked and unwelcome. That I think we can say that the flip side has happened for a long time, but I'm just bringing this up because, again, we want to make sure that with our robust DEI policies and practices that we're not violating the law. We still want to make sure that when it comes to making employment decisions, that we're not using race or gender in the process of doing that. And we want to make sure all of our employees feel welcome and invited and comfortable in the workplace. So if you aren't doing a DEI audit and you haven't done one, things that you are missing out on potentially is the lack of a starting point or a benchmark by which to judge your organization, especially when it comes to deciding whether or not to publish information like your EEO-1 report or other demographics. So you really want to know what your organization looks like, but as compared to similar industries and similar geographic areas before you decide whether to publicize that. That's, of course, unless you're legally required to do so. So there's lots of data and information out there that you can use for that benchmarking purpose to see how you look compared to similar types of companies. If you're not doing a DEI audit, another thing you might be missing is the ability to ensure that you are in compliance with various legal obligations. Certainly your EEO and non-harassment policies are at a minimum the things that you want to ensure that you have in place, and that those policies and procedures are meeting the minimum legal requirements. You also it might be difficult for you to ensure satisfaction of employees and investors. Again, as we just saw, there's such an increased focus and pressure from employees and investors on organizations to further their DEI efforts. And another area where we're seeing that not just from investors, but it's also during mergers and acquisitions. We're seeing requests for DEI audits becoming a routine part of the acquisition process. So if there's any likelihood that your organization might be going through that, having one done ahead of time so that you can see how it would look would certainly be a really good idea. And then, of course, if you haven't done an audit and set and determined that benchmark, it's going to be difficult for you to measure future progress as you develop processes and procedures over time. Where are you now versus where are you going to be in 5 years? So it helps to set those types of goals and strategies for moving forward. All right, so now that we've talked about why you might want to conduct a DEI audit, what are some things to consider before you begin? I think one of the first things that should at least be discussed and put out on the table is that the information might be discoverable. And by that, we mean could be subject to discovery in litigation. So keep in mind that the bar for what is discoverable in litigation is relatively low. And by discoverable, we mean having to produce to the opponent. So absent a privilege or a strong objection based on scope or relevance, the information that you gather during your audit, the analyses that are done, even the conclusions that you draw during a DEI audit could potentially end up in the hands of an opposing party. I think the odds of that are relatively low depending on the type of matter at issue, but certainly plaintiff's attorneys can be very savvy, so I wouldn't discount the possibility that your DEI audit could be discovered at some point. And we'll talk in a minute about involving counsel in your audit, which could certainly help create the attorney-client privilege. But I'm not sure this discoverability issue should necessarily keep a company from conducting a DEI audit. I think there's generally more to gain than to lose in doing the audit, as long as you're willing to follow through with any recommendations and conclusions that are drawn from the audit. It can certainly help you shore up any compliance shortcomings that you might not otherwise discover. So I do think that you want to do as much as you can to ensure that the audit would be protected by the attorney-client privilege, but just know that it's always going to be up to a court to determine whether or not that privilege applies. So you really have to know going in that the information could be released or discoverable. And I think the biggest downside to it being disclosed really would be when there are recommendations, especially compliance related recommendations that aren't considered and followed up on, because that could potentially demonstrate that the company is knowingly in violation of the law or failed to correct a known discrimination or equity problem. Another piece of information to consider is what data do you have available? What do you have or need that is going to be relevant or essential to a DEI audit? For example, do you want more information than that you currently have on social orientation, gender identity, national origin, those types of demographic information? Most employers are not collecting that level of detail from their employees. So you may want to consider doing a voluntary self-ID survey around those types of demographics. You want to definitely make sure it's voluntary and that the information will only be used in the aggregate. And you want to communicate to employees the reason for that request and how the information is going to be used. I think employees are more likely to respond to those type of surveys when you give them a reason to, instead of just putting it out there and say, oh, we're required to gather this information for reporting purposes. Kind of spell out what it is and how the information will be used to potentially to their benefit. So if there is data that you want to measure, but you don't have, you want to make sure that you determine if there's any potential issues in gathering it or asking for it. Typically in the US, requesting information from your employees on a voluntary basis is not going to be a problem, but you definitely want to look into any state-specific privacy or other laws that could limit what or how you ask for that information. Another thing I think that's important to talk about when it comes to data is, if your data is, what shall we say, less than reliable, I think is a nice way to put it. You need to address that, because using data that lacks reliability is not going to result in usable information that you want to act on. So I would definitely spend time before an audit looking at your data, making sure it's accurate, figuring out where the problems may be, and resolving that before using it. I just know, again, on the affirmative action side of my practice, we spend a lot of time with data, and most of the data we get from companies needs to be scrubbed pretty thoroughly before we can use it to prepare any reports or analyses. There are always holes. There's always missing information or incomplete information, or information hasn't been coded correctly when it was entered. There are all kinds of things that can go wrong. So that's definitely something that you need to look into. It's also important to understand what the purpose of your DEI audit is. So I think it's easy when we're doing an audit that's around legal issues like wage and hour or benefits, because then compliance is your objective, and the law is your standard for comparison. But it's different when we're looking at DEI, because that's aspirational, and the things that we are monitoring or measuring are not technically legally required, unless of course we're talking about EEO compliance issues. But once you get beyond that, these are all basically aspirational things. So I would recommend, as you begin the process of doing a DEI audit, that the team conducting it get together and map out what your objectives are. What is it that you hope to achieve? And then once you know that, design your roadmap for getting there. Different types of things that you might want to achieve with an audit is obviously that EEO compliance. I think that's an easy part of it and kind of a no-brainer. Let's make sure we're doing everything we're legally required to from an EEO perspective. The pay equity is another important aspect of DEI, and measuring pay disparities between different groups and whether or not those are explainable. Certainly looking at demographics of the workers in the organization and whether or not those are in line with what you would reasonably expect them to be based on various factors. Employee engagement in the organization. We talked about those survey results from the Glassdoor and others. What is your employee perception about the company's culture? You might also look at your existing DEI initiatives and what the effectiveness or lack thereof has been to date. All right, so we've done those first few steps. We've mapped out our objectives and our roadmap. So what type of information are we likely to need for conducting our DEI audit? Again, that's going to depend in large part on your purpose and your goal, or what you're hoping to achieve. But generally, your policies and procedures are going to be at the top of the list. And there's certainly, I recommend you look for all of your employee related or procedures or policies related to terms and benefits of employment. And start with the ones that are going to be legally required, such as your EEO policy, your non-harassment policy. So look at those and make sure that they cover and include the populations that are protected and should be covered. Look and see, ensure they're being disseminated to the right populations. Often you'll want to include not just your employees, but potentially your applicants. And if you have third-party individuals like temp workers on your site, it's often a good idea to make sure they are aware of your non-harassment policies, so that in the event that they experience harassment, they know how to handle and who they should report that to. Accommodation policies are really important here. Do you have policies that cover both religious and disability, and requests for accommodations and how those are handled? Your selection process. How are individuals hired? Do we have a consistent selection process, and is it documented? Do we have good records to show why people were hired and why people were not hired? Compensation, your policies around setting and adjusting compensation would be really important for ensuring equity and making sure they're up to date with various jurisdictions that prohibit asking starting salary, for example, or require the inclusion of salary information in job postings. Restroom policies are another example that I suggest be looked at. If you don't have one, it might be a good idea to create one to address transgender individuals in the workplace, and given your specific facilities and the options that are available, how that will be handled. Benefits, again, making sure that those are inclusive. Same for leave policies, and looking at how you can provide leave to individuals and flexible work arrangements. Grooming policies are another one on my list that I always like to look at. There are more and more jurisdictions passing Crown Acts, which prohibit employers from discriminating against individuals on the basis of of having a natural hairstyle. So you want to see if you are complying with that, and if you're in a jurisdiction that might not have that law yet, implementing it anyway. Certainly looking at dress codes to making sure those are not discriminatory on the basis of gender. Policies around your employee resource groups. Posters, is the company posting, complying with state and federal posting requirements, and do you have a practice in place for managing that and ensuring that they are updated as required? Looking at your recruitment process and ensuring that you have procedures in place to require recruitment towards diverse candidates. Are we doing as much as we can to create, to cast a wide net and create diverse candidate pools? Interviewing processes. Look at your forms that are used in that. Are they up to date? Are they being used correctly? And job descriptions are another one. I know that it's kind of painful to update job descriptions on a regular basis, but that's one area where I think it's really important to make sure you're looking at the minimum requirements when you're posting a job, to make sure that they're still accurate. Job duties change over time, and if you have a requirement that might tend to screen people out based on a disability, for example, then you want to make sure that's still necessary to include in the job description. And if it's not, then you should eliminate those types of things. Look at your self-ID process. We talked a minute ago about gathering information from your employees to make sure you have the type of data and metrics that are relevant to the analyses and measurements that you want to do. So look at your self-ID process to see if there's anything that you want to add to that or modify in any way. So really, when it comes to policies and procedures, I think anything that impacts either EEO or DEI in your organization, you want to review and assess those types of policies for one, just compliance. Are we doing what we're legally required to do? And two, do they go far enough? So even if they're legally compliant, do we want to be more progressive in any area? Like, for example, with the grooming or the dress code policies, and maybe adopting a policy that prohibits discrimination on the basis of having a natural hairstyle, even though you're not in a jurisdiction that would require it. So those are the types of things I think a good DEI audit would cover when it comes to policies and procedures. Employee surveys could also be important. You might want to get a better understanding of employee perceptions in the organization. So if you haven't conducted an employee survey in a while, this would be a good time to gauge their view of the workplace and the organization. If they're sharing it on Glassdoor, you might as well know it as well. And so depending on how detailed or in-depth you want to go, you might want to engage an industrial psychologist or other consultant to help you design that survey. But generally, I think you want to look for information or design the survey to measure or capture things like, is this a good company to work for? Would you recommend the company to family and friends? How long do you plan on staying? Do you feel that you belong and that the company is a welcoming environment? Are we doing enough to promote DEI? Those are the types of things that I think you want to get at. And I recommend you either ask open-ended questions, or you might want to require some type of multiple choice so you can get a consistent measurement, but maybe allow comments so that you can see if themes develop over multiple responses, because that can definitely be very informative. So I think employee surveys can be a very helpful tool to determine whether and where changes can be made, or at least considered. And sometimes, things could be relatively minor and easy to implement. You might get a suggestion about having some type of focused newsletter, or if you don't have ERGs, that's something that's relatively easy to implement. Or it could be, engaging in your local community activities, supporting social justice more. Those are the types of things you could potentially get some feedback on. But I wouldn't do a survey, an employee survey, unless you're willing to heed what you're told. Now, that doesn't mean you have to adopt and do everything that's recommended or suggested. Certainly that's not going to be feasible typically. But again, if you see these themes or an overwhelming response of a certain way that indicates there's a problem, then you need to take that information to heart and do your best to try to resolve it, because employees are going to know, right? They're going to know what feedback you were provided. And if they don't see the company doing anything in response to that, that's not going to help the situation. An important part, a very important part of most DEI audits involves data analytics. So there are all kinds of different things that you could look at. We talked a little bit about workforce demographics a moment ago, but I do think it's important for an organization to look at the racial and gender makeup of your workforce, and maybe even go beyond that and look at age and nationality and that type of information. But take a look at what the composition of the workforce is, and then you can compare that to the availability of different groups. So what is the expected demographics of your workforce, and how do you compare to that? So again, census data is available. The EEOC has aggregate information that you can use based on geographic areas and different types of industries. So that information is available for you to do those types of measurements. Then certainly applicants are really important when you're looking at your your DEI processes. Does the flow of candidates that you're getting, does it match what you would expect to see based on the census data? Obviously you're going to have different levels of interest in different types of jobs. That's not necessarily unusual. I think we have a tendency to think, well, we should have equal representation of males and females, or they should be equally interested in all our jobs. But, that's just not the case. We continue to see that fewer women are interested in certain types of jobs, whether because they're physically demanding, they have a more difficult schedule, or travel. Certainly that is not across the board, and I'm not implying that at all. But when you look at the self-selection process that applicants go through, we still see that there are some jobs that are more that men are more predominantly interested in. So you can use the information to see whether or not your applicant flow is consistent with what you would expect to see based on where you're located. And also, kind of similarly, you want to look at your hire data and compare the selection rates of the different demographics from your applicant pool to ensure that a component of the process is not causing adverse impact on the basis of a protected experience, protected characteristic. So, for example, if you were using a test in your selection process, or have some other type of screening process, you want to make sure that it's not adversely impacting any group based on a protected characteristic. Promotions, I think this is a really significant area to examine. You want to look at and see what are the rates that employees are progressing through the organization, and are females and minorities disadvantaged at any point? Remember back to that slide at the beginning that showed the larger representation of people of color in the entry levels of organizations as compared to at the executive level. That's what you want to look at. Where are females and people of color hitting that glass ceiling? And then examining what might be the cause of that. Retention. Are females and people of color leaving the organization at disproportionate rates? So even if their employees are leaving voluntarily, you shouldn't just discount that because they're not being terminated. Certainly termination rates are significant and important to review, but people leaving voluntarily can also tell you a lot about the organization or the culture. And if there's a disproportionate separation rate along race or gender lines, then that could be something you want to explore. Compensation, obviously, we want to make sure that we're doing analyses to ensure that we have equity, that we have pay equity, and that any disparities based on race or gender are explainable by legitimate job-related factors. Leadership development, succession planning. How is the organization planning for the future, and what consideration is given to developing diverse members of management? Analyses, if you're already doing some of these analyses, like your applicant flow or your hires, analyzing your selection process or promotions, what do they show? If you already have them, you can go back and look at those analyses and use them. Certainly if you're a federal contractor and you're developing annual affirmative action plans, a lot of this information you should already have. So, and sometimes I've noticed there's a disconnect or just a divergence between affirmative action on the compliance side and DEI on another track. And that's not unusual. But I think there, again, because of that overlap, I mentioned at the beginning, there are many areas where I think collaboration can take place between those groups. So certainly the data analytics is one of those. Artificial intelligence software, if you are using this, especially in the hiring process, you want to closely review that to ensure it's fair and non-discriminatory. Is it really looking at job relatedness, and just make sure it's not screening out people inadvertently and having an adverse impact on people based on race or gender. And performance management, is the process fair? Are women and people of color, are their performance ratings disproportionately lower without any explanation? Are you even looking at performance ratings by race and gender? I think that's definitely an important thing to look at, especially when compensation is related in some way to performance evaluations. Typically they are, in many organizations they are. So I think that's an important metric to look at to ensure that that part of your compensation process doesn't have any red flags. So there's lots of data available, and it's important to take advantage of that information when you're conducting your DEI audit. And then there's additional information that you probably want to consider as well. Your communications, both inside and outside of the organization. Are you promoting your equal employment opportunity and your DEI policies to your constituents? Are you looking at EEO complaints and not just taking them in isolation, but are you examining them for trends or issues that need to be addressed and headed off before things become potential bigger problems? Employee resource groups, do you have them? Or if not, is there an appetite to create them? What type of structure or process is there around your ERGs? Are they supported by executive leadership? Cultural activities. What types of events does the organization celebrate at the workplace? Do you have, recognize things like Disability Awareness Month or Hispanic Heritage Month? And, there are a wide variety of those and the potential to have celebrations around different diverse groups. Community events, very kind of similar. Is the organization involved in the local community? Are there philanthropic endeavors focused on racial or social justice or DEI issues that the company can become more involved in and more supportive of? Educational opportunities. Does the organization support employees in furthering their education through either tuition reimbursement or providing PTO to do that? I think that's definitely a value add for all employees, and can certainly help your employees advance within the organization and create just further opportunities for them. Accommodations, we mentioned that when we were talking about your policies, but examine how the organization handles accommodation requests. Do you advertise or provide a notice to your applicants that reasonable accommodations are available in the application process if one is needed? Do you provide flexible work arrangements to help your employees, especially females, that have caregiving responsibilities? We know that those tend to fall on women more predominantly than they do on men. So are we providing support in those areas? These was, I think, just some of the things that can help an organization achieve and maintain a more diverse workforce. So looking at your efforts in these areas is also an important part of DEI audit. So who should conduct a DEI audit? Obviously, you have two choices. We do it internally or externally. We talked about the attorney-client privilege a little bit early on. It may be a little bit harder to claim privileged if you're only doing the audit internally. Certainly, it isn't impossible. You can involve your in-house counsel, and you want to make sure, whether it's in-house counsel or outside counsel, that they are engaged and involved for the purpose of providing legal advice to the organization. So as long as that is part of the process and the audit is being done under that rubric, then you should be able to claim that it is attorney-client privileged. It might have a lower cost if you do it internally versus externally. Of course, you've got to take into account the resources that you have available, and whether or not you have can it spare the time involved from your existing employees. And of course, if they already have a full plate, then it might take them longer to complete that than if you engage someone from outside the organization to do that. And also, when it comes to the privilege issue, I just wanted to remind folks that although the results of the audit and the audit itself could be privileged, you want to remember that the information that goes into it, all that data and the policies and practices that we gather to include and to analyze, that's typically not going to be privileged anyway. That just exists. So it's the data itself is not going to necessarily be covered by the attorney-client privilege. I think it's also important to do a really thorough DEI audit, which means you're not just, it's not going to just involve DEI or HR. A really thorough audit is going to involve input from a wide variety of sources in the organization. So really any department or team that affects or has involvement in the terms and conditions of employment should be involved in your DEI audit. I have a very lengthy questionnaire that I provide to employers that are doing a DEI audit, and I have warned them before I give it to them that you're going to need to get multiple people involved to answer some of these questions, because it's pretty rare that just one or two people are going to have all the knowledge that's necessary to respond to all the questions. So you really are going to need to reach out and get input from, again, these wide variety of people across the organization. Utilizing the results of your DEI audit. So kind of our last step now, we've done our audit, it's completed. I think you want to use that information to develop your strategic DEI plan. What is your roadmap? I again recommend that you start with compliance. So if there are any areas where the organization is out of compliance with a legal requirement, you want to address those to limit potential liability. So that's always going to be goal number one. Then if you identify any barriers to EEO or advancement, you want to figure out how to reduce and eliminate those. And those could potentially be legal issues. But if you have adverse impact, for example, in one of your employment processes, you want to identify that and see what you can, if you can identify what's causing it and how to eliminate that or remove it. Update policies. Again, if there are areas where you can be more progressive than the law requires, this is the area to do it. You can go beyond what's legally required and cover things that or provide for things that go beyond that. Training or educational opportunities. Are there areas where you can provide additional training to staff that's not legally required, but could help further your DEI initiatives? So things such as unconscious bias training. And then further data analytics. Have you performed all of the analyses that you want to do or that you should do? Do you have data gaps? Is there additional information that you want to track or look at? So identify additional data that you might need to gather, and then how you could use that. Goal setting. There's been a lot of emphasis lately about setting diversity goals, generally for females and people of color. And I generally recommend that you don't want to set goals for females or minorities unless there's a reasonable basis for doing so. And so, what do I mean by that? It goes back to comparing your workforce demographics to the availability. and seeing if you are in line, reasonably in line with what you would expect those demographics to look like. So goals generally are not necessary or meaningful unless you're kind of way off the mark of what you would reasonably expect your representation to look like based on the availability. So if you do set goals, however, you want to make sure that the availability data is providing the basis for determining what the appropriate goal should be. And I generally recommend placement goals like federal contractors do in their affirmative action plans. So, you know, that would generally look like something like along the lines of, you know, 30% of new placements in this job will ideally be people of color until our representation of people of colors is close to what we expect it to be. And you also, you know, you need to make sure you're taking into account expected attrition or turnover, as well as potential placement opportunities when you're looking at what a reasonable goal should be. So I generally don't recommend that you just pick an arbitrary number when it comes to deciding what your goals are. And I don't think setting a specific time or date for achievement is necessarily appropriate either, because, you know, keep in mind, goals are meant to be gradual and incremental. You can't just accomplish everything overnight, right? We can't change our workforce demographics overnight. It all revolves around how many new opportunities there are available. And also remember that the words your CEOs use matter when it comes to talking about goals. And certainly that can be used as evidence in lawsuits if the way they talk about them make them appear or sound to be like quotas or things that are not reasonably attainable. So just make sure they're educated about this process. And I think it's important for organizations to just be mindful and definitely get input from your legal department when setting goals. And then kind of coming back for full circle to what we started talking about, publicize or not to publicize information about your demographics or other DEI policies or procedures. And this probably isn't really a legal issue, at least for the most part. It's really a business decision about how transparent an organization wants to be. And there certainly can be many drivers on that question. We talked about those, your shareholders, your employees, even customers. But it can be a big decision. So, be thoughtful about that and decide what you want to share and to whom you want to share it. And I do have one note here about the National Labor Relations Act and protected concerted activity. I had a client ask me a question about sharing some of their confidential employee demographic data with employees. But they didn't want to see it on social media. So I discussed that with one of the labor lawyers at Constangy, and because that's not my area, but they cautioned me because under the National Labor Relations Act, employees have the right to share information with coworkers and third parties, except in, there certainly are exceptions to that, and confidential, proprietary, trade secret type of information can certainly, be maintained confidential. But otherwise, employees do have the right to talk about current terms and conditions of employment with their coworkers and potentially even with others outside the organization, and even a request that they keep that type of information confidential could be considered a restraint on the exercise of their NLRA rights. So just be careful in those circumstances. So my recommendation here is, if you want to provide that information to employees but still keep it confidential, just talk to a labor lawyer first to see what's feasible and how to legally accomplish that. And then I think we're coming up. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. We've gone over a couple minutes. I'll wrap up here. Diversity theater, avoid diversity theater. So this was just from an article, and you can see the citation there at the bottom. I read an article that just threw this red flag up about companies that are promoting their DEI policies and practices, but maybe aren't following through the right way. And so it creates this kind of sense that, or to employees, that there's this diversity theater going on. Yeah, they're saying all the right things, but there's no follow through. And so it creates a sense of, disconnect between the company and your employees. So, if you're going to go down this path, and certainly we all want to be more focused on DEI and promoting that, just make sure you're conscious of that. And so just adhere and make sure you're following through with your commitments. And I certainly don't want to turn this into a commercial, but Constangy does have some DEI audit services. So I'm more than happy to talk with anyone about those offline if you have interest in that. So I think we have a couple questions.
Yes, Kara, thank you so much for that. I know that this is a really important topic, so I appreciate all of your insight. We had a couple in the Q&A box, and then a couple came directly to me, but let's cover the Q&A box real quick.
Okay. So I see one that says, I always thought of EEO and D&I as two different things. Are you saying they are the same? So no, I'm not. So I apologize if that was confusing. I think they're different, but they overlap, because I do think your EEO, or your non-discrimination policies and practices, certainly go a long way in ensuring that you have a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. So, so there's overlap, but they're definitely different. I think what I was trying to stress is that in order to have effective DEI practices, you have to achieve EEO first, right? You've got to have those equal employment opportunities and those things that are legally required in place. What studies specifically are showing the disparities in advancement and promotion? So that was one of those slides at the beginning, and there's a site. Each one of those pages has a citation at the in the kind of footnote on the bottom of the slide, but that was a Mercer study. So I think if you Google that, you'll be able to find it. But if you have any issues, just let me know, and I'll you can email me and I'll help you find that. And then oh, okay, this last one is a good one. We have some employees who live in Florida. Given their anti-woke law, what do you recommend for addressing DEI issues through awareness training? Are we being hypersensitive? We only have 2 employees there and don't want to unnecessarily cause issues. We have simply told them that the trainings are not required, but this feels very uncomfortable. Thanks for your guidance. So whenever it comes to Florida, I recommend we pull out the statute and look at it very closely and compare it to what your training or DEI awareness training might be. I think the vast majority of training topics are not going to violate that Florida law. It reminds me, if any of you are federal contractors, you'll remember the executive order that President Trump issued towards the end of his presidency that prohibited federal contractors from conducting, it was phrased as divisive racial or gender concepts or something like that. But it prohibited things that were kind of common sense, things that you wouldn't cover anyway, like telling people that they're inherently, one race is inherently superior to another race. So I think a lot of what is prohibited by the Florida law is very similar and goes well beyond what most employers would consider doing. But if you have employees in Florida, I do think it's worthwhile to look at your offerings and ensure that there's nothing that crosses the line. And then if they do, you want to look at, not only is it not required, but I don't think you want to be providing it to them at all. I'd have to again look at the statute and how it's worded. But those are the things I'd want to look at. So definitely something to be mindful of. Very good question. And Amy, you said there were some other questions. Those were the ones in the Q&A.
Yes. So we have a couple more. Let's see here. So the first one is, what can we do if diverse candidates are not applying for positions?
Okay. So, that's a really good question because, sometimes there's only so much you can do. You can only hire the people that apply for jobs. So my recommendation there is it all goes back to your recruitment. And I think it's good to analyze what are you doing to try to recruit diverse candidates. Because that's really the where you get the foothold in creating diverse candidate pools from which you're choosing. So look at your sources, and if those sources are not have not been effective in providing diverse candidates, then try additional sources. There are lots of agencies and vehicles out there to help you identify more diverse recruitment sources. And again, it will depend on your industry and the types of candidates, the types of experience that you're looking for. But for example, if it's STEM-based jobs, there are certainly organizations now focused on helping women find jobs in those organizations and in that field. So just be I think focus on your recruitment. Historically, Black colleges and universities are another good example of places to recruit.
Awesome. That was a good question. Okay, the last one here is, do you know of a trusted source or place that there are recommendations of diversity percentages by industry? Any recommendations or trends you're seeing?
What is the question on where to find that data?
Yeah.
So one place the place I use most often is census data and census information. And I say that because I help federal contractors prepare their affirmative action plans, and that's what we use. So we, in that situation, every job title is assigned a census code. And then that census code, you can drill down and you can go as detailed as county level and get what the percentage of people in whatever the geographic area is have the skills generally to do that type of job. Now, I mean, the categories are fairly broad, so it's not an exact science, but the census data can certainly help you identify at the local, county, metropolitan area, even state, combination of states or nationally, what you would expect the demographics for different types of jobs to be. And then the other resource that I'm aware of is through the EEOC, and it's been a while since I've accessed this, but I remember it just came out like a year or two ago. I remember when they promoted it, and it was a way to you could enter information about where you're located and the type of industry, and then it would give you kind of the aggregate EEO1 data. So by broad EEO1 category of the different demographics that other EEO1 filers had in those areas. So again, it's been a while since I've looked at that, so I hope I'm stating that correctly, but that's my recollection of what was available on the EEOC site.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Kara, for staying a little bit over time just so we can answer some of these questions. Everybody, you saw her contact information up there. If you have any questions or need anything, you can reach out to Kara or myself. My information is amy@hrsimple.com. Please feel free to email me anytime. I will be sending out, I put it in the chat, but I will be emailing out the recorded version of this, the slides, and the SHRM and HRCI credit codes. So everybody has those by the end of the day tomorrow. And I also put in chat, our next webinar is going to be on September 21st. It's a little bit of a different dynamic. You can bring pretty much any questions you have and kind of like try to stump our attorneys. There's going to be 2 partners on with us that will just be answering any questions you guys have about human resources and employment law. And registration is coming soon on our website. So you will all get an email about that. And I just appreciate everybody coming. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again so much, Kara. That was amazing information. It was a lot. So you covered so much in that hour, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Everybody have a great day, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.